The second part of World War I. I'm continuing on with the combat, which I said could be described for 4 years as mass slaughter, largely because of the concept of trench warfare, which we will never fight again. We don't line up facing each other and slaughter each other. This is the method of warfare, European warfare for centuries, and this is what World War I was all about, and into parts of World War II as well. Excuse me. So very, very high casualties. I'm working with those slides between basically 10 and 20 in there with some of the illustrations of different ways you could die in World War I. We have no idea of the slaughter. The lists of deaths that were published in the paper, the name of the military dead, would go on for pages and pages in France and England. Heavy artillery, shell shock, poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks, barbed wire, first use of airplanes. That was a new invention, don't forget, in the early 1900s. And they were first used, of course, as surveillance. Later on, they couldn't figure for a long time how to mount a machine gun in front of the pilot because the bullets from the machine gun would tear the propellers apart. Somebody finally figured out how to synchronize that. Then they become more lethal. 55 planes in 1914, 750 by the end of the war, mainly Allied, but also German. The Red Baron is a World War I German hero. The Germans supplied their pilots with parachutes. The British did not. The thinking was that if you give the guy a parachute, he's going to bail and he's going to lose the airplane as well. They did not provide the British pilots with parachutes. So if your plane got hit, you went down with the plane. Combat pilots in World War I on both sides lasted an average of 20 days. It was basically a suicide mission. The other factor I want to talk about is this is the last horse war. Horses were used as draft animals to drag the artillery around, to drag supplies around, because cars and trucks are just coming in. They were used, but not heavily. Horses were used more, which means that another good movie of the war is War Horse. If you have not seen that, the other one I could recommend, there are two versions of it, both good, All Quiet on the Western Front. And this is the German side of the war, but it basically deals with the horrors of trench warfare. Very good. Key scene in both of those All Quiet on the Western Front versions is the slaughter of the horses. They estimate 20 million on both sides were used as draft animals in the war. The survival rate, they figure 500,000 survived by the end of the war. So remember, a horse is 800 to 1,000 pounds. So not only do you have horse manure all over the fields that they're fighting on, you have 1,000-pound carcasses that are not easy to bury and that take forever to decay and rot. So the main cause of deaths in the war, the main cause of casualties, half of them were disease and infection. The other half were war wounds, weapons. There was no, as there was in World War II, no antibiotics. So it was very easy to get anything infected, not only a wound. If you were wounded, you had a 90% chance of dying, not even from the wound, but from infection, blood poisoning that would set in within 2 days. World War II, the numbers are reversed, 90% survival rate due to one factor, antibiotics. You could get a cut. You could have a blister. This happened. It would get infected, you got blood poisoning, and you died. So imagine living in dirt trenches with horse carcasses liberally scattered over everything, and all you need is a cut. And that infection could kill you, and did kill a lot of people. It was a horrible, horrible, horrible war. Europeans completely traumatized by it. We were not so much, because we did not see the slaughter firsthand. Our men did, but we did not as a country. If you look at slide number 21, the casualty lists, and these are estimate, we don't even know, 9 million soldiers of all kinds, over 3 million British, something like 6 million French, and 7 million Germans. The amazing thing to me is 25 years later, the Germans have enough population to start another war, because World War I wiped out a generation of young men in France, Germany, and England. Again, half of these are due to infections and disease as well. Americans, we lost over 100,000 deaths and another 250,000 wounded. Much, much less. This is one reason it wasn't as traumatic, because our casualty lists were much, much smaller. They existed, but nowhere near what the German, French, and English were. Some idea of these casualties: Verdun, which was a long siege, essentially, a bitter, bitter battle back and forth. Remember, this is trench warfare. So you wait in your trenches for 2-3 weeks, then there's an order to charge. You charge across 5 miles, you push the Germans out, you get into their trenches. 2 weeks later, they charge, they push you back 3 miles, then you sit in the trenches for another 3 weeks, then you charge again, you push them back 2 miles. You are going back and forth over the same ground. There are points on the Western Front where the same ground was held back and forth a dozen times. How stupid is this? What kind of loss of life is this at the end? Verdun, which was a long-term battle, something like 8 or 9 months, 600,000 casualties, including 450,000 French in over the course of the battle, and 200 French officers, 10,000 men in 4 days at Verdun. 10,000 men. And what did they gain? Nothing. A couple of miles of ground. Battle of the Somme, 420,000 casualties for a week or 2 long battle. Belleau Woods, when the Americans get in, we have good records on our casualties. The first American battle, 3 weeks it lasted. We lost 5,000 Marines in the first 3 weeks at Belleau Woods for an area a mile square. So they could take an area a mile square. Terrible weather, dense fog in places, very dense woods in northern France and Belgium. Many times we couldn't even see what we were shooting at. Neither could the enemy. So accidental deaths, friendly fire deaths as well. 1 unit of Americans started out with 400 men. At the end of the year, they had 25 alive. So there were units that just disintegrated, all being casualties of one kind or another. The British at one battle lost 160,000 casualties, dead and out of the war with injuries, for a 5-mile stretch. 160,000 men to gain 5 miles, which they lost again later. Americans, of course, are very famous for handing out candy bars to kids and adopting stray animals. And of course, every American unit, and a lot of the British and French ones as well, picked up stray dogs and stray animals that became their mascots. There was one unit that had a little dog, a little French dog, they picked up, and they brought it back with them at the end of the war. The little dog went through battle after battle, went through 2 years of the war, unscratched, came home as a mascot, somebody adopted it, but that same unit went through 15 officers, one killed after the other. The dog survived, 15 officers, or 14 officers did not. The battle I want to talk about specifically, slide number 22 and 23, is Gallipoli. The battle in Europe is very easy to describe. The Germans advanced. They pushed the Allies back to the Marne River in France. But when the Americans arrived, they begin to push the Germans back. It is basically trench warfare and struggling back and forth over the same little piece of ground. Gallipoli is different. Remember that the Ottomans, Turkey essentially after the war, were allies of the Germans. And the New Zealand and Australian troops, New Zealand and Australia were part of the British Empire, so they are fighting on the British side. They came in, they were assigned the responsibility to take Gallipoli. If you see Gallipoli on the map, you know exactly why it is important on slide 22. Gallipoli, that peninsula, guards the entrance into Constantinople, into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, which formerly was Byzantium. Okay, so the Australians and New Zealanders were given the task of, you invade, take the Gallipoli Peninsula, and then we can send our warships in, we can send troops in and take Constantinople. It did not happen that way. New Zealand alone, I spent a lot of time in New Zealand and Australia, so I'm really kind of interested in this particular battle. New Zealand alone sent 100,000 troops. This was 10% of the entire adult male population. Of the 100,000 that were sent, and they were sent to Gallipoli, they were sent to Asia Minor, 20,000 were killed, 40,000 were maimed and crippled. That is a total of 60% casualties. What happened is the Australians and New Zealanders were landed in troop landing ships, and they had troop landing ships, and the Turks had gotten artillery from Germany because they were their allies. They lined up their cannon and their machine guns on the top of the cliffs, very rugged cliffs in this area. The poor guys were landed and said, take those hills, and basically the Turks were just shooting fish in a barrel. Wave after wave of Australians and New Zealanders, ANZAC forces, Australian New Zealand forces, charged those hills and were mowed down like fish in a barrel. Australia and New Zealand completely traumatized by these casualties. They have never forgotten it. The best war museum I ever saw was in Canberra, Australia, and it was all about Gallipoli. They lost everything. They lost an entire generation of young men. Australia, New Zealand, the South Pacific today is a nuclear-free zone. They don't ever want to be involved in another war like that again. I'm reading from one of the New Zealand officers. It was a matter of just a disorganized crowd of those fine, brave fellows, not knowing where to go, no one in charge, because they were all scattered in the scrub. No planning. We were not intended to land there. We were not supposed to land among all those hills, ravines, and precipices, and we were cut down. So this long-term absolutely traumatized everybody in Australia and New Zealand. They never did take Gallipoli. They never did take Constantinople, so it becomes a stalemate in that part of the world. Another key factor involved with Turkey is slide 27 and 28. This is the Armenian genocide. Armenians are Christians. They were Christians in the Middle East. Remember, Constantinople originally was Byzantium. It was a Greek Christian city for centuries. The Ottoman Turks become a nation during World War II. The Ottoman Empire has fallen apart, but Turkey is a new nation. And during the war, while the war was going on and people were otherwise occupied, all those little stars on the map of Turkey in slide 27 are Armenian settlements, Armenian towns. They rounded up the Armenians, either slaughtered or drove them out. The next slide is Armenians with whatever they could carry being driven out of Asia Minor. At the end of World War I, there were very few Christians left in Ottoman lands, particularly in Turkey. It became Islamic. I know about this because my mother was a child in Salonika in northern Greece right after World War I, and she played on the streets in her neighborhood with orphans from the Armenian genocide. Greek families had taken in little kids who had gotten out but were orphaned. Total slaughter. Total slaughter. Turkey to this day does not acknowledge the Armenian genocide. The interesting thing about this, of course, is this is the first genocide we have in modern times in the world, where a people are slaughtered because of who they are, because of their ethnic background. The first ethnic slaughter that we have, essentially. Okay, so total slaughter for 4 years. I'm moving on to slide 29, the war at home. If you want slides of World War I, if you go on YouTube and Google World War I combat, we have a few films of them, but very grainy, very black and white. Film was just coming in, and film in war zones was unknown. So we don't have much footage of it at all. We have a few modern movies, but almost not all our movies are World War II, which is much more heroic. World War I was not a heroic war. It was just mass slaughter. So I'm moving on to a more interesting part, perhaps, a more complicated part, which is the war at home, World War I in America. We become, in both world wars, what we call the arsenal of democracy. What is an arsenal? It is a weapons stockpile. So our National Guard has arsenals, different places where they store their weapons. America becomes the suppliers not only of our own troops in Europe, but also of the French and English, also of our allies, not only with weapons, but with food, clothing, supplies as well. At the end of the war, France has lost a generation. England has lost most of a generation. Germany has lost a generation of young men. Their economy is shambles. Who's the world's superpower? Guess what? We are, because we were not touched directly by the war, but we supplied all of the allies. World War I also puts our economy and our government under great central control. So after the poor progressives spent 15 years trying to break down big monopolies, World War I comes along, and we find out that in order to control production and make sure we have enough war supplies, we need central planning. We need large industries. And it reversed the entire pattern of the progressives trying to bust trusts. The War Industry Board was a government agency created by Woodrow Wilson. Again, you have these quote-unquote expert government managers. They were put into large companies. Woodrow Wilson was called at the time an economic dictator, which he kind of was. Remember, government and business had been fighting each other before. Now, during the war, they have to become partners. This is direct government control of production, including domestic production, not just war materials, all production. Government control of production, you are well into socialism, sliding into communism, depending on how much control. And there was a lot of control. Materials, hours, salaries, everything about production was controlled by government, quote-unquote, experts who were put directly into factories. Not only of war materials, but for example, they didn't stop making clothes and shoes for civilians too, but everything was controlled and regulated. The number of buttons on a man's shirt, you could only have 6 during the war because you needed buttons for uniforms. If you remember, women up to World War I wore those high buckle shoes that had all kinds of little buttons you had to fasten. This is when we get low top shoes because they needed the leather for boots during World War I. Skirts got shorter. Big surprise, you need the material for uniforms. Railroads were heavily regulated. Their rates were heavily regulated because you had to move supplies and materials around. Nonstop production. You don't want workers out on strike. Workers' organizations pledged not to strike during the war effort, and there were no antitrust actions brought against companies as well. Even during the huge flu epidemic, which we've heard a lot about, which was exactly 100 years ago, towards the end of the war, factories stayed open. They never closed, although there was no way really at the time, except for masks, to prevent the spread of flu. They were using masks 100 years ago, go figure. Not surprisingly, company profits increased about 300% during the war. War is great for business. People make a lot of money. They put the head of the American Federation of Labor on the war board to control production and to make sure there were no strikes. This is when you begin to get better working conditions. You begin to get 8-hour days in many industries. They were good to workers because you don't want to strike in the middle of a war. We produced, in the 2 years we were in the war, it started a little bit before because we were supplying allies, but in the 2 years we were in the war, catch this, The American factories produced 22 million blankets, 10 million coats, 34 million pairs of shoes, 3 million rifles, and 5.5 million gas masks, not only for our own men, but the Allies as well. Public had to support the war effort. Most people did once we got into the war, once our boys started going over. How do you do this? Many different ways. The war touched everybody, even if you weren't directly involved and had somebody fighting. First of all, everybody bought Liberty bonds to the tune of $23 billion. 2/3 of the war was funded with a Liberty bond. The equivalent today is a U.S. savings bond. The government sells you a piece of paper and they promise to repay you with interest later on. People signed pledges. Buy a bond or lose your job was a common phrase. So if you're working in a factory, you had to buy, let's say a $2 bond or sign up to buy $1 worth of bonds once a week. Otherwise, a lot of peer pressure here. You'd get beat up. You were called a lousy, Kraut sympathizer, nasty guy. So most of the war funded with Liberty bonds. The other way we financed the war was through an inheritance tax and the first income tax since the Civil War. The income tax never went away after World War I, so you can blame Woodrow Wilson for that. The tax was only 1% to 7%. Later on, it was raised to 4%, up to 67%, later on in World War II, but it was only on the wealthy. So if you made over something like $4,000, then you paid a tax. So it's a wealth tax, essentially. So the war is funded. Wars are very expensive through Liberty bonds and through increased taxes. And although people moaned about the taxes, they paid it. Rationing. Oil, coal, rubber, metals, there was no artificial rubber then, were rationed. And you had things like the Boy Scouts and kids go around and collect medals. So if you had silver buttons on something, you donated that. If you had an iron fence outside your house, that disappeared very quickly. There were neighborhood drives to collect medals to melt down into bullets and cannons. Oil and coal is pretty obvious to run machinery. Everybody who could had a victory garden. You dug up your yard and you planted vegetables. Why? Because farmers who had large acreage, they could send their produce directly to the war, and you could help our boys and our allies overseas. Food will win the war, a great poster slogan during the war. This was voluntary, again, a lot of peer pressure in this. There were meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays and different ways to ration and save, particularly meat, because, of course, the theory was that soldiers need meat to fight on. Lots of people took a food pledge to have a meatless Monday and a wheatless Wednesday. We had much less rationing than England and France did, but people were heavily involved with this. People knit socks for the soldiers. They rolled bandages, sugar, meat, wheat, also rationed. The other thing they did, oddly enough, was collect cooking oil in a can on top of your stove. Cooking oil was collected every so often from a neighborhood barrel. It was made into nitroglycerin, is made from oils, fats. So everybody, every day, was involved in the war effort, which is not true today. Propaganda. I have some wonderful propaganda posters in there, slides 30 to 40. We had a government agency. The guy's name was George Creel. I always think Creel newsreel with that. And he was in charge of the Committee of Public Information. This is a propaganda agency. There is no other way to say it. We are promoting the war effort and our guys and making the other guys look bad. If you are going head to head in a war, foot combat, and this is largely an infantry war, and you have to bayonet or kill somebody, the first thing you have to do is make the enemy less than human. You cannot identify him with yourself, or you can't go up and bayonet a guy. So the Germans immediately become Huns. They become devils. Manipulation and control of media. Hollywood switched to making war propaganda films. You had guys who went around giving public talks to community organizations, to PTA meetings, to Rotary clubs. The Germans immediately, you can see what's happening in those slides, become Huns. They become Prussians. They talked about the Prussian cure, in other words, a mongrel dog, the claws of the Hun. Creel wrote a book after the war about this agency called How We Advertised America. Who was reading it 15, 20 years later? The Nazis. Got some of their ideas from our own war propaganda organization. Newspapers didn't have to be censored or gone through. They did this voluntarily. So nothing bad came out about our men and our war effort, and everything bad about the other guy, some of which was true, a lot of which was not true. If you look at those slides, you can tell right away who is German, because the German helmets had little points on the top. So you can right away tell the Germans, and they all look pretty terrible in there. A lot of anti-German racism when we get into the war, even before that. Remember, we had over 8 million in America, first and second generation Germans. People who were pro-German, if they had any record, or publishers of German language papers, for example, we registered 500,000 of those 8 million as quote-unquote enemy aliens. The head of the FBI was a man named J. Edgar Hoover, who was there for decades and decades. Any verbal threat against the United States was a prison sentence. We set up prison camps specifically for German sympathizers. The conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra was fired because he happened to be born in Germany. A lot of attacks on German culture. Their songs, their literature was banned. Oftentimes, German language books were collected and burned in town squares. They had, quote unquote, Stein breaking fests, where you smashed your German steins in public. German foods were banned and renamed, of course, the old Liberty cabbage thing. This is when Frankfurters become hot dogs, by the way, and have been hot dogs ever since. Teaching the German language was dropped in high school and colleges. Books were taken out of German books were taken out of libraries in high school and colleges. In Iowa, they passed a law that only English could be spoken in public, not German. So you couldn't open your mouth if you were a German speaker in Iowa. This is when a lot of the German towns in Texas, like Fredericksburg and Comfort, and some of those towns in the hill country, become very closed in for good reason. Their neighbors were not very fond of them, and they became very insular and isolated. They closed in upon themselves. People with German names were fired. Some were beaten. We had a few that were actually killed by mobs for one reason: they had a German name. So if you were Hans Schmidt, you changed your name to Henry Smith very quickly. I'm not making this up. German Shepherds were called Alsatians at the time. They did change the name. They were not killed so much, but Dachshunds, which were clearly German, they did have, in some places, rounding up Dachshunds and killing them because they were German. So this is a dangerous thing going on. You had organizations, the American Protective League, you had the Boy Spies of America. Their job was to go around and hunt down German sympathizers. So you have this paranoia and this neighbor looking around at neighbors. What's going on there? Are they Germans? Are they doing anything to hurt the war effort? I'm quoting from some of our own propaganda. The Allies are standing with their backs to the wall, fighting wild beasts. Again, you cannot kill a guy face to face without turning him into a wild beast. And that's what we did with the Germans. Also, don't forget, there's a lot of anti-Mexican propaganda because of the Zimmerman note. Some anti-Jewish propaganda, that the war was always a Jewish conspiracy, round up the usual suspects, and Irish because the Irish were not helping the British. And if anything, sympathizing with the Germans. So this is vicious, vicious stuff. This is dangerous because the same thing happens after every war. The same thing happened with the Japanese in World War II. The same thing happened after 9/11. You had, and I heard very intelligent people, very well-educated people saying, we need to round up every Arab American and ship them out. It's very easy to demonize the enemy. Be really, really careful of that. And the standard example is World War I, where we did it and did it horribly here in America. Okay, I'm going to stop there and talk about some legal laws passed that also came back again and again, and then talk about the end of the war and the Treaty of Versailles, because there is a direct line between World War I and World War II. Stay safe, take care.